Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to Identity's event from colonial subjects to Black nations, racializing the Caribbean within global Blackness, with our speaker, Dr. Jamella N from Bowdoin College. In this talk, Dr. Gao will examine how global racial hierarchies rooted in histories of racialized Black labor under capitalism define Caribbean nations as Black, tracing the global historical processes of colonialism, imperialist, underdevelopment, and neoliberalism in the Caribbean. She will show how these processes then inform racist policies that target nations and their migrants by relying on tropes of both Black criminality and exploitability, now reproduced on a global scale. Through a comparative case study of both Haiti and Jamaica, Dr. Gao will argue for how both nations became positioned within local and global racial hierarchies reliant on global Blackness, and how they and their diaspora redefine themselves through their own iterations of Black nationalist identity. You can read the Identities article from Colonial Subjects to Black Nations, Racializing the Caribbean within Global Blackness. The link will be attached in the chat. Dr. Gao is assistant professor of sociology at Bowdoin College. Her research centers on themes of Black migration, borders, and illegality, comparative race, ethnicity, and racialization, global political economy, and immigrant activism. She examines how Afro-Caribbean migrants navigate racial and ethnic identity, inclusion and exclusion, and diasporic politics through immigrant status and Blackness in the United States. She has published several articles on these topics in Identities, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and other journals. She co-authored an edited volume titled Modern Migrations, Black Interrogations, Revisioning Migrants and Mobilities Through the Critique of Anti-Blackness, which interrogates immigration scholarship through the interdisciplinary lens of Black studies. Her current book project, titled Black Migrants from Black Nations, Race, Blackness, and Immigrant Exclusion, explores how racial and ethnic and nationalist status markers shape the racialization and criminalization of Haitian, Jamaican, and Afro-Cubans in South Florida. This is the latest in our Identities series. Identities, Global Studies, and Cultural Power as a journal, and our series and various other activities explore the formation and transformation of racial, ethnic, national, transnational, and post-colonial identities in the contemporary world. It locates culture, representations, and identities as key sites for processes of domination, struggle, and resistance, recognizing their intersection with other forms of social division and identification. Identities provides an interdisciplinary space for new theoretically informed empirical research and critical analysis, which opens up questions of race, ethnicity, and culture. It draws on and brings together insights from anthropology, cultural studies, sociology, social policy, cultural geography, political science, and social psychology. Identity seeks to engage established and emerging scholars in the field in contributing high-quality articles, special issues, commentaries, and debates which address key questions of culture and identity, such as this one. And so now I'd like to welcome Dr. Gao and begin her talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Erin, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Dr. Jamella N. As mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Bowdoin College, where I research and teach on immigration, race, illegality, and broadly the Black Caribbean experience. I want to say thank you so much to the Identities, Global Studies, and Culture and Power Journal for inviting me to speak on my paper titled From Colonial Subjects to Black Nations, Racializing the Caribbean Within Global Blackness, which is published in the journal. Thank you as well to Michaela Broadman for organizing this talk and encouraging my inclusion. And thank you as well to both Erin Winter and Lancaster University for supporting this talk. Oh, sorry. So today I'm going to discuss my paper by first introducing how it fits into my larger book project, tentatively titled Black Migrants from Black Nations, as described earlier, as well as other related work. I will then discuss the paper itself, including introducing theoretical frameworks I use, highlighting the centrality of the Caribbean and Black nations, and of course, examining my case studies, Haiti and Jamaica. After discussing these key takeaways from the paper itself, I also want to briefly discuss how they might be relevant to the current immigrant moment, particularly in the United States, and the current militarization of the Caribbean Sea today. So first, situating this work. This paper provides a key intervention in my larger research on the experiences of Black Caribbean migrants in the US and more broadly. The US Caribbean border/borderlands, described in US policy as its third border, as opposed to the US Mexico and US Canadian border. And some overarching questions that motivate my work include: how does Black racialization and perceived foreign status doubly impact Caribbean migrants in receiving nations? And more broadly, how is their racialization tied to global patterns of anti-Black racialization of their home countries? And this paper, as you might understand, focuses on that second point more broadly. I explore these questions in this paper, as well as in my current book project under review by Stanford University Press, titled Black Migrants from Black Nations, Race, Blackness, and Immigrant Inclusion. In this book, I focus on the experiences of Jamaicans, Haitians, and Afro-Cubans in South Florida who navigate interconnected processes of racist exclusion based on their Blackness, which is then associated with criminality, their foreign status, which leads to their explicit targeting by the US nation state and makes them vulnerable to both police surveillance and increasing criminalization by immigrant enforcement. So being targeted both by anti-Black criminal enforcement, as well as kind of the convergence of what immigration scholars have called crimmigration, where immigrant enforcement starting to look a lot like policing and surveillance. Related, I'm also exploring how these processes play even more vividly at the US Caribbean border, where in one work titled Policing the Migrant Crisis, which draws from Stuart Hall's work, I examine how implicit and explicit anti-Black racist rhetoric directed towards this border has led to its increased criminalization and militarization. Towards the end of the talk, I will say a bit more about how the arguments generated from here inform this next project. So first, I want to start with theorizing race and class together through Black labor. Jamaican sociologist and cultural theorist Stuart Hall's compelling theorization of race and class together provides kind of the framework for this paper and consequently drives my analysis. I think it can be useful to read his quote aloud. He says, quote, "The structures through which Black labor is reproduced, structures which may be general to capital at a certain stage of development, whether the racial composition of labor, are not simply colored by race, they work through race." And I love this quote because it clearly articulates how to think through race and class together, the overarching theme of this paper. We can't see them as separate, but working together and articulating one another. In doing so, I draw on important figures who theorize race, class, colonialism, and capitalism together in order to help me think through not only what race is, but what race does in a capitalist system. For example, in my paper, I draw on Caribbean authors such as Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Stuart Hall, of course, and others who help to complicate Blackness as not simply a phenotypical definition or description, but a racialized category of labor, exploitation, and social control, which, as Achille Mbembe and Catherine McKittrick point out, have laid foundations for how we understand more modern forms of immigration, incarceration, and spaces as racial today. I also emphasize the importance of race as an ongoing process of both being racialized and contesting and reworking those racial categories. This is especially true for Blackness, which has not only stood as a symbol of shared oppression through the slave trade, but also as a political stance and diaspora. So key to theorizing through race as an ongoing process is the shift from the race relations framework, which is both, I argue, ahistorical and non-dialectic, in that it presumes race and racism as eternally existing, non-disputable, and importantly, untethered from the dynamics of power, including capitalism. Authors Omi and Winant importantly provided the framework of racial formations, which not only redefined race as a project, but emphasizes that's the intentionality of race and racism. So we tend to think race and racism as two separate things, but race itself is a racial project in service of racism. Racialization also provides a helpful framework for my theorization of Blackness. As I say in my paper, racialization, quote, emphasizes how race is not a descriptor or set of relations, but rather an ongoing process which differently ranks and excludes people, and from which emerge sites of contestation, especially by those negatively racialized. Hence, race and racism can better be understood as a dynamic, ongoing process of racialization that takes into account how individuals and groups challenge and rework racial identity as a site of contestation. I also draw on key theorists who, rather than seeing race and class as separate, think through them together, as Hall insists, by exploring how capitalism works through race to distinguish global racialized divisions of labor, and in particular immigrant labor, as especially exploitable and commodifiable. Such labor is so-called valued for its flexibility and precarity. And by this, I mean migrant labor, in ways similar to yet different from enslaved labor, is able to move and be moved, whether through push and pull factors that necessitate individuals from the global South to seek safety and livelihood elsewhere. But there's also the reality that immigrants, refugees, and other people that don't have the protection of citizenship, they're always already on the verge of being moved elsewhere due to increasingly stringent immigration laws. Draconian measures, as we've seen across the world, force people, particularly from the global South, into untenable situations in which they must rely on their exploitability to survive in poorly paid jobs or dangerous work. Further, the rise in immigration control as a branch of criminal enforcement or immigration can keep migrants in a constant fear of removal. This emerges from the expanding surveillance apparatus of immigrant enforcement and the constantly shifting categories of immigrant legality itself. This includes the mounting number of requirements that make it difficult to ensure their ability to stay. This array of policies is rooted in the globality of race, which is itself established in the globality of Blackness. For example, I bring back Sylvia Wynter as well as Mbembe here. Wynter identifies, quote, the globality of racialization as a, quote, archipelago of human otherness. And in that, she includes vulnerable people, migrant labor, the homeless, etc. And Mbembe grounds this very deeply in what he calls the becoming Black of the world. And both of these authors, what they mean by that is that these global systems of control and mobility that stigmatize and make vulnerable the most marginalized actually emerge from earlier systems of colonial capitalism built on the control of Black movement and labor. So through exploring racialization via Blackness, it's important to also recognize how Blackness itself, while a global category of race and identity, functions as a dual signifier of oppression and anti-colonial politics. Situating Blackness as a global category, as well as a regionally and historically specific one, recognizes the reality that diaspora has become a site for the production and reproduction of Blackness. Whether through Black nationalism and its variants, most notably recognized in the Garvey's Pan-Africanism, Aimé Césaire's negritude, or even broader anti-colonial and anti-capitalist stances, most embodied by Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, and others, Blackness remains a flexible signifier of race, but also of very clear politics. We also can't forget that beyond these kind of more notable leaders, everyday Black immigrants and Black people in general also reckon with racial and ethnic claims to Blackness. And I appreciate how Orly Clerget describes this as a racial consciousness spectrum, i.e. that people don't just identify as Black, they can identify as ethnic, and sometimes how they identify depends on the context they're in and the groups they're associating with. So in this paper, I take a historical approach to thinking about how racialization emerged through the birth of modern capitalism and its reliance on explicitly non-white and Black labor, a relation produced by colonialist capitalists in the Caribbean and Americas. This relation not only solidified race as a laboring class category, but fortified whiteness as a form of property and privilege, as I'll explain in later slides. Importantly, it also informs later racial dichotomies of non-white, non-citizen, precarious, flexible labor, and white citizen labor. Under later iterations of capitalism, we can now see a global racialized division of labor that includes migrants in the post-colonial core, other Caribbean peripheries, and in the homeland. As I'll explain, plantation economies have restructured the Caribbean and ensure that the Caribbean continues to be a site for mobile labor in the neoliberal present. In sum, I'm arguing for how Black Caribbean migrants and the nations from which they migrate can become racialized as Black based on these structural, social, and cultural processes. And then I reflect on the implications of these processes overall. So in the first kind of large section of the paper, Tracing Blackness to Race, Class, and Mobile Labor, I take that historical materialist approach to outline the emergence of modern race in its current iteration under capitalism. I start with the transatlantic slave trade to, as Eric Williams and Rodney insist, center capitalism's emergence and its economic and social foundations in colonialism. While plantation owners systematically targeted multiple groups for exploitation, they mentioned the case of white European indentured servants and indigenous communities, which eventually were slated, or very soon slated for genocide. African enslaved people became the so-called preferred source of commodified labor. As I say, quote, under capitalism, race emerged to create and maintain a hierarchical global division of labor. Through race, capitalist exploitation is made natural. And the transatlantic slave trade really laid the foundation for modern capitalism's reliance on that flexible labor. However, key to this transformation was the use of racism and sexism to divide and dehumanize those it sought to exploit. By policing the boundaries between Blackness and whiteness as social relations, colonial capitalists produced a, quote, racial contract, according to Mills, or a white wage, as Du Bois famously describes in Black Reconstruction, for those designated as white. At the same time, those who were racialized as Black were a distinctly global, racialized laboring class under capitalism, and according to Winter, they became the, quote, ultimate referent of the, quote, racially inferior human other. Importantly, scholars who think through race and other intersections with capitalism together point to how the slave trade not only produced a Black laboring class central to capitalism, but also centered the plantation rather than the factory as the site of capitalist development and resistance. So continuing in this section, we see if we consider how Blackness is, quote, not an essence, but a positioning, as Paul eloquently states, and how Patrick Wolf, settler colonial scholar, describes racial identities as being constructed in and through the very processes of this enactment, we can recognize how Blackness emerged in its context as both a marker of labor and identity, but also a global category. In fact, enslaved Africans came to embody the commodification of labor itself, and like commodities, were relied upon for their productivity and their circularity within and across plantations and various colonial sites. More beyond the slave context, Bashi traces how the history of migrants from racially Black nations became welcome solely for their labor rather than their potential citizenship. An iteration, perhaps, of this flexibility and commodification of labor. She describes how in the early 19th and mid 20th century, nations like the United States, Canada, the UK, have historically produced immigration policies that allow for temporary, more circular immigration, but make residency more difficult, in particular for Black labor. In the US and Canada, this has been informed, for example, by various guest worker programs that continue to recruit Caribbean migrants for temporary schemes in agriculture, service work, and healthcare. However, at the same time that there's this desire for their labor and this circularity, scholars like Tanya Golash-Boza and Pira Tandagnu Sotelo also note that alongside this active recruitment of migrant labor, there has risen what they've called a, quote, gendered racial removal program, in which Black and brown migrant men have been targets for systemic deportation. And they point to these deportations are happening in the shift away from needs specifically for Black men labor in construction. So once their labor value is no longer needed, then they become super surveilled, criminalized, and slated for deportation, thus contributing to this cycle. We can also think of more modern examples beyond the US. I think of, for example, the Windrush scandal a few years ago in the UK, in which Jamaican elders were slated for deportation who had been part of, or at least connected to, that Windrush migrant movement. And that too has precedent because many of them fought so much to be able to stay. You can see the series of Commonwealth citizenship laws that limited Jamaican migration and chipped away at the citizenship that they had as members of the British Empire at the time in the mid-20th century. So in all these different ways, we see both active recruitment, but then chipping away at things that will allow them to have full citizenship in the places that they decide to reside. And we can see this in broader non-white migrant communities, but these scholars are arguing that it's grounded in this history of anti-Black racism and also the mobility of Black labor itself. So going back kind of to the Caribbean, we see this commodification of Black labor leading to what we would call the transnational Caribbean. And what that means is before abolition, Black mobility distinguished the Caribbean as a flexible space, since access to laborers made borders at times less important. The slave trade generated not only racialized labor, but a distinctly mobile labor force. For example, enslaved Blacks were moved themselves across plantations and nations, whether as, for example, seafarers who traveled the Americas, runaway enslaved people who sought freedom elsewhere, leaders of rebellion who, if in addition to their punishment, might be transferred to other plantations, as some critical scholars of history and resistance have told, as well as this broader transnational reach spread through stories of rebellion and freedom that they passed on. As I say in the text, borders mattered less than Black folks' ability to gain work as laborers or find freedom as escaped slaves. However, the end of slavery saw new forms of colonialism as empire-owned land they worked on as slaves became privatized, and newly liberated Blacks then worked on as cheap laborers alongside other imported labor in the 19th and early 20th century. Black Caribbean and other scholars describe this as the plantation model of Caribbean underdevelopment. Hence, even though they and their descendants were free, the restrictions on their ability to own land and thrive as individuals and communities was limited by these further transformations of Caribbean nations from colonial outposts to independent nations today. In the neoliberal era, Caribbean nations become newly dependent on the colonial centers, or neocolonial centers, we could say, for economic restructuring and consequent debt. What this all means is that post-abolition Caribbean nations experience new forms of accumulation through the expansion of monocrop agriculture, including bananas and sugar, and later tourism, and the reliance on export processing zones. This is tied very much to structural adjustment programs, which I can, discuss at length, perhaps if folks are interested. But what's important here is the role of debt in further kind of providing these sites of accumulation is so significant that David Scott, for example, insists that Caribbean debt is the other side of European theft. So we can't think about, the current underdevelopment, to use Walter Rodney's phrase of the Caribbean, as not tied to these earlier colonial patterns. I will add, though, of course, that since then we've also seen challenges from Caribbean nations themselves to more fully sever the relationship with colonial powers, as well as demand reparations. So if we see this transnationalization of the Caribbean, we can also see the transnationalization of Caribbean migrants themselves. So at the same time as the Caribbean has continued to be restructured, Caribbean migrants and those who don't move also produce their own new migratory pathways. Indeed, post-abolition, Caribbeans, quote, voted with their feet and migrated within and outside the Caribbean seeking work. whether it was looking for work in sugar production, as described before, on islands like Cuba, Guyana, Trinidad, or Jamaica for banana production, and so many others, Caribbean migrants moved for better pay when working and expressed agency even as they navigated their new status as racialized mobile labor. If they couldn't get good wages in one place, they could migrate somewhere else. And in that way, they still obtained and kept their agency. US capitalist expansion was key to this shift, as we, maybe know infamously, the United Fruit Company, the acquisition of Cuba and Guantanamo Bay, and the building of the Panama Canal provided new outlets for US imperialism, as well as, on the other hand, opportunities for Caribbean laborers. Hence, such transformations established, as I say in the paper, a quote, global migrant culture characterized by its flexibility of movement and global outlook. At the same time that the Caribbean was transformed by debt, as described before, Caribbeans, local and abroad, subsidized those political economic transformations, whether through working in these spaces I've described before in agriculture, U.S. projects, health and service industries in Caribbean, U.S. and Europe. They, like other nations in the global South, we can think of the Philippines, for example, that rely on their diaspora, their remittances support those that they leave behind. Those who live abroad also use their political capital to sway policies in their nations. We see this especially in the United States, where my research is kind of focused, where Haitians, for example, have sought to influence US policy towards their nation from afar. However, even as they, advocate for their nations, their ability to do so is deeply shaped by the racialization of their nations as Black. Now, what do I mean then about racialization of nations as Black? The becoming Black of nations refers to both the quote, racialized rendering of nations as Black due to political and economic strategies from abroad, and the more agentic, contested, and ongoing redefinitions of Blackness by nations, diasporas, and subcommunities themselves. As Haiti and Jamaica have sought to define themselves through Blackness, they've also been cast as Black in divergent ways. I discuss both nations in turn and in comparison, and I'll start with the example of Haiti. So I want to start with this moniker often associated with Haiti in the news, media, and in kind of common conversation that, in my research, talking with Haitians, as well as people who are invested in the diaspora, that Haiti is often referred to, quote, as the, quote, poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. This phrase contributes to the idea that Haiti is often in need of aid and outside influence and political control. Indeed, its current political destabilization has led to ongoing discussions on how military forces from Kenya, for example, as well as the US, of course, should intervene in Haiti. This rhetoric has a historical basis and continues to shape how Haitian migrants, especially in the US, have been perceived and even demonized by political leaders in the US. As I say in the text and replicate here, this form of Black racialization, quote, serves to put in racial terms the impacts of neoliberalism and previous colonial policies. A nation is perceived as Black and thus racially inferior in the eyes of the US state, which draws from older colonial sentiments and their more modern usage to justify invasive foreign policy, which often casts as a benefit to the occupied country. And I'll get into more detail on that. But before I do that, I also want to emphasize Haiti's own definition of Blackness and its more radical origins, not just as an identity, but a form of radical citizenship and anti-colonialism. The picture here is of a statue in Haiti of a call from the marooned soldier challenging and calling to others to resist and start the revolution. And I think that image and kind of all that it personifies has had reverberations across the Black diaspora. And I think it's important to start with that. So in 1804, Haiti gained its independence based on its own successful slave revolt. It's also notable for being the second modern independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, though one could argue, by banishing slavery, they actually lived up to the ideals of independent nations, I would argue, more so than the United States at that time. Haiti, in its foundation as a nation, produced this radical counter narrative to the racialization of Blackness that I've discussed thus far. For example, as I lay out here, they changed the new nation's name from Saint-Domingue, its French colonial name, back to Haiti in homage to its original indigenous name. The Haitian Constitution also equated Haitian citizenry with Blackness, which is a powerful move because it asserts not only political agency of Blacks at a time when they're considered human, but it universalizes Blackness itself. Related to that, one of the first Haitian presidents, Alexander Pétion, notably welcomed African and indigenous people to seek freedom in Haiti. And this is at a time when, slavery is still happening in other states. So the existence of Haiti itself was such a radical and transformative move. And that's what made it so powerful. In many ways, it was a bold rebuttal to nations still dependent on slavery. However, Haiti didn't stop there. Beyond their borders, they supported Simon Bolivar's fight for Venezuela's independence, and thus Haiti plays, and I would argue continues to play, an integral role into the more radical definitions of Blackness that embodies an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist spirit of Black resistance. Now, the other side of that. So, at the same time as Haiti's refusal of this more hegemonic version of Blackness leads to its targeting and further racialization through a negative form of Blackness or global Blackness that I defined earlier. Initially, Western nations refused to recognize Haiti's sovereignty and limited trade at a time that would have been crucial to its development. Further stymieing its development is the fact that France demanded reparations from the island nation, that it, continued to pay off to the tune of $560 million in today's currency. We've also seen at times a continued fraught relationship with the broader Caribbean community. Something that may be less apparent is the close relationship between Haiti and the United States. I like to tell my students, for example, how from 1915 to 1934, the US occupies Haiti at the request of bankers, who then took over Haiti's national bank, bought up and privatized Haitian land, and instituted a forced labor system that mirrored the racialized system of slavery that had recently ended in the United States. Unfortunately, after the US's more direct involvement, Haiti was battered by dictatorships, most notably the Duvaliers, and has experienced various forms of political instability from the 20th century to the present. Part of this political history is informed by various military coups, for example, the ousting of their democratically elected president, Aristide, direct and indirect occupation by the US and UN, which led to devastating disease outbreaks, for example, and then the 2010 earthquake, which devastated the country, as well as in 2021, the assassination of Haiti's then president, Jovenel Moïse, all have collectively put Haiti in a bad light and contributed to the notion that it is a nation incapable of governance. And yes, there's, much to be said about, the state of Haiti at this moment, but to think about it ahistorically through that moniker of poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere without thinking about the things that Haiti has to contend with, that itself is that form of racialization as Black. I also want to note, and I'll talk about this more when we think about the present, is current US President Trump's comments in 2018 denigrating Haiti as well as other African nations as his language, shithole nations, and not wanting to receive migrants from there, as well as comments in 2024 targeting Haitians in Ohio. All of these are part of a larger casting of the nation and its people as incapable of self-governance, dangerous, and decidedly Black in a very deeply colonial sense. So in some ways, I hinted that, the racialization of Haiti as a Black nation also spills over into the reception of its people, but I'll describe a bit before. Or just a bit more. So as described before, Trump's comments targeting Haiti can be linked to the targeting of Haitians in the US more broadly. Unfortunately, he is not the first. His comments have a precedent in the past stigmatization of Haitians within the diaspora through their association with HIV/AIDS. Such stigma led to the shunning of the country, a ban on their blood donations, and a broader fear of Haitian migrants. So rather than focusing on the health and care of those who did at the time were diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, it became a broader stigmatization of the Haitian diaspora and actually led to their politicization, something that continues today. Further, we can think about how the fear of Haitian migrants and Black nations in general is informed by the broader criminalization of the past they took via the Caribbean Sea. If you're familiar with the history of Haitian migrants and their stigmatization, you might be familiar with the phrase boat people. Through that rendering of Haitian migrants as, quote, boat people, Haitians were stigmatized by their means of movement, and laws instructing the Coast Guard to act as border patrol collectively criminalized the border space encompassing the Caribbean nations connected to the US via the Caribbean Sea. Something that I'll talk about later is how it is the arrival of Haitians fleeing a destabilized government that we see shifts in immigration policy where the Coast Guard doesn't just pick up ailing boats, but focuses on deterring detention and sometimes turning boats back around to Haiti as well as other Caribbean nations. One can view these patterns through the reality that the fear of Haitian migration is heightened by the fact, I would argue, that Haiti has always been seen as a Black nation. So not just migrants, but specifically Black migrants from Black nations, hence the title of my book, for example. So I discussed a bit about the example of Haiti. Now I'm going to turn to the example of Jamaica. If I can, yeah. So turning to the case of Jamaica, we can see a different kind of racialization as a Black nation. Rather than being targeted as a distinct ethnic group as Haitians have, I suggest that, as I say, the becoming Black of Jamaica began in colonialism and slavery and continued onwards through working class Jamaican migrants who were predominantly Black. Blackness also meant a shift from enslaved labor to a shared migrant struggle and solidarity by Jamaican and Caribbean diaspora. So where Haiti's anti-colonial Blackness was countered by a fear of Haiti itself, Jamaicans have continued to be racialized as a Black labor force that is notably circular and temporary, as I'll explain. So when we think about the becoming Black of Jamaica, we also, of course, will start with their own definitions of Blackness through nationalism and the response to post-colonialism. So Jamaica has negotiated varying definitions of local and global Blackness since its historical evolution as a nation. I mentioned, for example, Marcus Garvey as who's Jamaican, being key in that, those kind of local and global definitions of Blackness. But I'll start with kind of the material elements and kind of discuss the tensions that emerge. So post-abolition, Jamaica remained a British colony and experienced many of the land grabs I described earlier by rich land barons and an influx of new labor, all of which kept working class Black Jamaicans trapped in low-wage work unless they migrated abroad. After independence in 1962, Jamaican nationalism sought to celebrate its multiculturalism, best embodied by the nation's motto, which I have there, quote, out of many, one people. However, anthropologist Deborah Thomas cautions against this optimist rendering of what she calls a, quote, Creole nationalism. As she explains, it ultimately privileged a largely non-Black elite at the expense of its broad working class. This revealed the pigmentocracy that divided the island into a racialized class hierarchy. We also have to recognize that these transformations post-independence must be couched within the fact that neoliberalism and structural adjustment largely challenged and sidelined universalist demands of various worker struggles led by women, LGBTQI groups, Marxist, and other diverse organizations within the nation at the time. And I'm thinking of that moment, for example, when Michael Manley is president and he kind of shifts towards this more universalist transformation of society, you know, in the context of third world nationalism and pride, but we see the collapsing of that with the expansion of neoliberalism. And with neoliberalism, Jamaica's economy shifted to rely on free trade zones and tourism at home and guest worker schemes abroad. Right now, for example, we see vividly in what's been called the beach birthright environmental movement, in which Jamaicans in Jamaica insist on having access to their own beaches, not only for personal enjoyment, but for access to fishing and other natural resources. So in order to accommodate, the kind of more popular tourist spaces, which if you go to Jamaica really look like fortified centers, Jamaicans are saying, look, this land belongs to us and we should have access to it, instead of the privileging of tourists and outside enjoyment. So continuing on this theme of the becoming Black of Jamaica, we have to think about too, not just the becoming Black of Jamaica itself, but also the becoming Black of their migrants as Black mobile labor. So beyond the island, while Jamaicans are largely lauded for their hard work and even take pride in their work ethic, as people I spoke to, and as a child of Jamaican immigrants have heard often, their ability to migrate is shaped by its history of agreements with other nations to provide seasonal agricultural work, including in Maine, where I currently live, gendered labor in the service and healthcare industry, and so many other spaces. While largely able to migrate without stigma, unlike Haitians, as we've discussed, Jamaicans are still largely valued for their labor and not their residency, as such schemes emphasize, quote, the temporary nature of their labor. According to the IOM, in 2018, quote, Jamaicans were the second largest group of migrants after Mexicans entering the United States as both H-2A, on both H-2A program for seasonal agricultural workers and the H-2B program for seasonal non-agricultural workers. And I think that's significant. One of the interventions that I try to make is thinking about the fact that while we have larger in the United States representation of migrants from, for example, Latin America, Caribbean migration has been part of that for a very long time. In fact, the Bracero program, which is often seen as kind of one of the initial systematic use of guest work in the United States, and specifically Mexican migrant labor, Jamaicans were recruited alongside of that. So Jamaicans have had kind of this clear history of being part of this temporary labor force. And the other side of that, as mentioned earlier, they can be made temporary in other ways through deportation. Currently, for example, there's a concern in the rise of deportees to Jamaica and how they can be better reintegrated into a nation, some of whom might not have lived in since their youth. Another factor is the significance of their status as Black in the US, Canada, and UK, for example. Lots of great works have been talking about the targeting of Jamaican migrants for their perceived criminality and so-called association with drugs. So even as Jamaican migrants have this association with hard work, once they kind of fall out of that scope, they're immediately criminalized and slated for deportation. And what this means in the everyday is that since as Black, they're surveilled by police, they become doubly vulnerable for detention and deportation, since, especially in the US, which is my context, law enforcement bodies frequently collaborate. So in all, their status as a Black nation also contributes to their varying status as Black and migrant, but both statuses can and do lead to their deportability. So thinking about that, what does all of this mean for the present? As mentioned earlier, I talked about how in, as I say, September 2024, then presidential candidate Trump and running mate J.D. Vance shared comments regarding Haitians so-called eating cats in Springfield, Ohio. This led to the targeting of Haitians yet again, after, as we've seen, this history of the stigmatization of Haitians. And once President Trump ultimately linked such racist comments with action. Currently, there's an ongoing court battle surrounding the temporary protected status for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. We also see the current militarization of the Caribbean and extrajudicial killings of Trinidadian and Venezuelans in the Caribbean Sea for fear of their drug running. And described as a move to target drug runners, such rhetoric relies on an oft-used criminalization of Black and Brown people as suspect and potentially dangerous. And I'll add to, I talk in this slide too about Secretary of State Marco Rubio in March reaffirms what's called the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, and I'll talk more about those policies soon. He highlights, quote, the, quote, illegal immigration crisis and transnational criminal organizations in the Caribbean itself. So there's a criminalization of Caribbean migrants and also the Caribbean as this space that needs to be controlled. So lots of echoes we hear from the case of Haiti, for example, and Jamaicans. But there's precedent, as always, for this criminalization and militarization of the Caribbean. Starting kind of in the 1970s, US President Richard Nixon declares the war on drugs. And scholars point out that while we do rightly do focus on the United States and the targeting of especially Black and Brown folks for criminalization of drugs possession, this also informed the criminalization of the US border, associating the Caribbean and Latin America with drug running. Some scholars point to specifically the targeting of Jamaicans in that broader category of criminalization through drugs. And as mentioned, before, alongside the stigmatization of Haitians, we've seen changes in policy with the Coast Guard. So in the 1980s, when Haitian migrants are fleeing political instability, President Ronald Reagan at the time issues Proclamation 4865, High Seas Interdiction of Illegal Aliens, which I also want to emphasize, which originally titled Haitian Migrant Interdiction Operation. And this policy is key because it instructs the Coast Guard to focus on the interception of undocumented migrants at sea, something that wasn't necessarily part of its policy before, but now the Coast Guard, whose job is generally to patrol the seas, is now doing the work of Border Patrol. We also see in 1991, Guantanamo Bay, which is more famous for the US war on terror, is being utilized as a detention center. And in fact, we've seen moments in which Caribbean migrants have been detained in Guantanamo Bay in the present, but it continues to kind of be this specter, right? In 1992, US President George H.W. Bush issues Executive Order 12807, the interdiction of illegal aliens. And this is just to kind of ensure that the Coast Guard continues the interception of undocumented migrants at sea. So many times we think of the US-Mexico border as being the super surveilled space, but I want to point out here that the Caribbean itself has been a surveilled space as well. And these last two kind of historical points I've added on to make the point that this isn't just the US going out. This is also in collaboration with other Caribbean nations. So in 2001, the Third Border Initiative, established by the US, CARICOM, and Dominican Republic, amongst other things, initiates coordination between the US and Caribbean in monitoring the border for what they call criminal activity, and this includes immigration. In 2010, US President Barack Obama and 13 Caribbean nations established the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which Marco Rubio now recently, currently affirmed. Oh, and encourages collaboration in border enforcement between the US and the Caribbean. So the transformations of the Caribbean into this kind of criminalized space must be couched within these histories that I've been discussing. We can't think about it without thinking about the ways in which Black nations, nations are racialized as Black and associated with criminality, coloniality, and this need for social control. So to conclude in sorts, these policies and histories that inform and affirm the racialization of labor and migrant status continue to target Black Caribbean migrants and the Caribbean itself. Further, global Blackness, Further, global Blackness remains an important framework for tracing the racialization of immigrant labor, particularly in the United States. As I conclude in the last line of that paper, these linkages between racialization past and present reveal how race, labor, and immigrant precarity are tightly connected within a racialized global capitalist system. However, I do want to end with a reflection on resistance. In the Caribbean, I've hinted at this earlier, there have been movements towards seeking reparations from former colonial nations. In fact, in 2014, CARICOM introduced a 10-point reparation plan to that effect, and CARICOM being a collaboration between between Caribbean nations that talk about economics, policy, immigration, amongst other things. Further, I've also just found out that in 2021 and September of this year, there have been two Africa CARICOM summits, so collaboration between African nations and the Caribbean with a goal to strengthen ties across these Black diasporas and address historical injustice through political representation and a continued discussion of reparations. Hence, the more radical definition of Black unity and politics lives on. Thank you.